Now that we have our JSON web token, let's now add an admin and authorization middlewares to only allow authorized users and admins to access certain endpoints. If you remember our last episode, our login endpoint gives us the access token we can use. We can now pass this token in the authorization header to gain access to certain endpoints that requires authorization. And we need middleware to enable authorization. Middlewares are really just another set of handler that intercepts HTTP requests and performs some pre-processing steps. Our admin and authorization middlewares are going to read the token from the authorization header, and our admin middleware is going to verify if the user is admin, and we're also going to verify if the token has expired and some of the other fields such as issue time, audience, issuer, subject, and so on. Here are the routes that we have added so far. Once our middlewares are implemented, the authorization rules are going to only allow admins and authorized users to access some of these endpoints color-coded here. So first we have these public endpoints to get the product, list the products, create a user, and log in. And we also have endpoints for admins only, such as to create a product, update or delete the product, and list the orders, update the order status, get the user information, or deleting the user. And lastly, we have the endpoints for the authorized users only to create an order, get my order, delete my order, and also to update my user information, log out, or renew and revoke my token. Again, I'm going to continue from where we left off. And the first thing we have to do is to associate our existing orders to our users. And in order to do that, we have to create a user ID foreign key in our orders table. So I'm going to add a migration file to add the user ID foreign key. And once I run this command where I run the migrate image to create a migration file called add user ID foreign key, that's going to create our migration files. So that's going to create an up file as well as a down file. And inside my up file, I'm going to add this query to alter my orders table to add a column user ID and add this foreign key constraint. And then inside my down file, I'm going to add this query to alter the table and drop this foreign key that we just added in our up file. And now that we have added our migration file, I'm going to come to our ecom API store, types.go, and add this user ID field to our order struct. I'm actually going to add this below the total price here. And we also have to make a small change to our store file. So inside our create order function, when we insert into our orders table, I'm going to add this user ID field, as well as here inside the values. And with my get order function as well, I am actually going to get my order based on the user ID. And instead of selecting from the orders where the ID equals to the ID, I'm going to check if it's equal to the user ID and pass in the user ID field here. And this one is going to be from the order.id. So one thing to note here is that it actually makes more sense to make this into a list order by user ID, because when we do select from the orders and call db.context, that's only going to return a single order, and it's possible that a user has more than one order. And we actually already have this list orders method, which is going to be used by admins. So we want to keep this, and I'm also going to keep this as is and assume that a user will only have one order for the time being. And now that we have added our changes, we can now move on to our handler directory and create our middleware.go file. And I'm going to name this package handler. And before I continue, I want to bring you to this Gochi README page to show you how a middleware can be defined. And here we have an example of a middleware. And middleware is just a function that receives a HTTP handler and returns a handler func as shown here. If you scroll up here, there are more examples, like the admin only function that returns a handler func like this. And what it's doing is getting the context, reading the value from the context, and checking if it has an admin permission. So if there's no admin permission, it's going to return an error. And to apply our middleware, we can call r.use to apply this middleware to this entire router stack, or we can also use r.with for inline middlewares. So now back in our middleware file, I'm going to create this function called auth middleware that takes in a http.handler as its argument, and we're going to return another handler and return the handler func like this. As I described in the slide, we want to first read the authorization header and verify the token. And once we have verified the token, we have to pass our claims or our payload down the context. But if you remember, we need access to the token maker in order to verify our token. And we need to make a small change to pass our token maker down to our middleware function. If we go into routes.go and randomly add this r.use method and dive into the use method here, use accepts a middleware that's of type function that takes in a handler and returns our http.handler. So to satisfy this function type and at the same time receive the token maker as its argument, we're going to have an outer function that receives a token maker as its argument and return a function that we have defined here. So we're going to turn this function into an anonymous function and return this as part of the outer function. And I'm going to add this function called getAuthMiddlewareFunc that receives a token maker as its argument and return a function that receives a handler and returns the handler type. And I'm going to close this function here. And down here, let's add a helper function called verify claims from auth header that receives a http.request as well as our token maker as its argument. This will give us our user claims and an error if there is. And this is the function that we're going to call from inside here. So we're going to pass our request and our token maker into this function. The first thing we want to do here is read our authorization header. So we're going to call getAuthOrization, and this is going to give us our auth header. And if the auth header is empty, we can return an error saying the authorization header is missing. Then we're going to call strings.fields to split our auth header by whitespace, and this is going to return a slice of strings. We have to verify if the length of the fields is 2 because our authorization header is going to have our bearer token as well as our token. So we know for sure that we are going to have 2 different parts here and the length has to be 2. And if the length is not 2 or the fields 0 is not equal to bearer, we're going to return an error saying this is an invalid authorization header. Then we can get our token from the first index. Then we can call tokenmaker.verify token and pass this token into that method. And this is going to return a claims as well as an error if there is. And if there is an error, we can return an error saying it's an invalid token. And if not, we can return our claims and nil. And you might have realized by now that we are not explicitly checking if the token has expired or not. And that's because if we look into our verified token and dive into the jwt.parsewithClaims method into this method here, we are actually doing the validation here. So if we go into the validator.validate, it's going to check if it has expired and other fields that is provided by the registered claims. So that is not something we have to explicitly add there. And now that we have defined this helper function here, we can return to our middleware func. And this is going to return the claims and an error. And if there is an error, we can return status unauthorized. And then to pass our claims down the context, we have to call context with value. And we're going to pass the context of this request, our key, as well as our value. So we haven't defined this key yet. So I'm going to add our key struct up here, call it auth key. And this is going to be of struct type. And we're using an empty struct as our key here because that's a better practice in Go. There's a blog post explaining why an empty struct is better than a string as a key. But the basic idea is that the logic will have to compare different keys to look for your key. And if you use string type as your key, it will have to traverse the string to compare and find your key. So unlike string, an empty struct don't cause any memory allocation and it is faster. So you will see that empty structs are very often used as key instead of a string. And this is going to give us our context, and we can call next.serve HTTP, pass in our response writer and our context. And the admin middleware is exactly the same with just one extra logic. So down here, I'm going to define a function called getAdminMiddlewareFunc. And the extra logic we have is just checking the claims and checking if it's admin. And if the user is not admin, we're going to return an error saying that the user is not an admin. And that's all we need to do for our middleware. Now I'm going to go back to our routes, get rid of this. But before we continue, we have to make sure that we have access to the token maker. And if we go back to our handler file, you're going to realize the token maker is actually a private type. So I'm going to make this into capital T and just replace all the existing token maker with our public token maker like this. We scroll down here. We have one more here and one more there. And back in our routes, I can now access our token maker from our handler like this. So starting with our products endpoint, we need to add admin middlewares to the create product, update, and delete product endpoints. And if you remember from the example I showed earlier, we can add an inline middleware with this with method. And what we can pass in here is our get admin middleware func. And this is where we're going to pass in our token maker as its argument. And then with our update and delete product endpoint, we can add inline middleware with the with method, but we can also add this method called r.group. And inside this group function, I can take what Copilot is suggesting here. So we're calling r.use to apply this middleware to this router group. And we're going to do something similar for the orders endpoint. I'm going to add this r.group and then call r.use to call get auth middleware func and pass this entire orders endpoint inside this group. And there's one little change we're going to make here. Instead of getting the order based on the ID parameter, we're going to read the user ID from the user claims that's passed down through context. So I'm going to bring this out of the orders endpoint and create its own endpoint and call it my order. And then just for the list orders endpoint, I'm going to add an inline middleware to only allow admins to access this endpoint. And then down to our users endpoint, I'm going to make a few changes here because we know that we are not going to have any subroutes under login. I'm actually going to just change this to login endpoint and get rid of this here. And same for the logout. I'm just going to get rid of this here. And I'm going to group these endpoints according to different authorization rules they have. So if you remember the endpoints to create a user and log in, and then we're going to have a group up here that's going to be for the admin endpoints. So I'm going to call r.use get admin middleware func and pass in our token maker, and the endpoint to list our users and delete a user is going to be only allowed for admins. And then we're also going to have a group for the authorized users. So I'm going to call r.use get auth middleware func and then pass in our endpoint to update and log out. Lastly, we have the tokens endpoint. Again, we don't need this grouping here. So I'm just going to define the single route, and same for revoke. We are not going to read the session ID from the URL parameter. I'm just going to bring these together and create another group because these endpoints are only going to be allowed for authorized users. I'm going to call get auth middleware func, pass our token maker, and pass the entire tokens route into this group. And then we have one last step to read our user claims from our context in our handler. For example, inside our handler, if we scroll up to the create order method here, you're going to see that our order is not associated with any user. And because we have passed down our user claims from our middleware with this context with value and passing this context down with next.serve HTTP, we can now access this context from within our handler and associate this order to the user that is actually logged in at that point. And we can do that by calling the context method on the request and call .value and pass down our auth key that we defined earlier. And this returns an any type. So we'll have to typecast this into our token.userClaims struct. And this is going to give us our claims. So I'm going to call this toStoreOrder method from up here, which returns our store order, and assign the user ID from the claims.id. And I'm seeing this red squiggly line here because the claims.id is of integer type. So I've actually defined a wrong type for our user ID earlier. So I'm going to come back to our store types.go and change the type to int64, save that. And now that we have assigned the user ID from claims, we can now pass our store order into this method. And then I'm going to scroll down to the getOrder method. Instead of reading the ID from the URL parameter, I'm going to read the user claims from the context again, and I can simply pass down the claims.id here. And then down to our update user. We used to read the user email from the user request, but instead of doing that, we're going to read the claims again and pass down our email from the claims here. And one thing to be mindful here, if the user request doesn't have an email field, meaning that the user is not trying to update the user email, this patch user request is not going to assign any value to our user.email. So if we just call patch user request and pass this user into our update user, our email column is going to be empty. So what we have to add here to verify is that if the email is empty, we're going to assign the email from the claims.email. And down inside our logout user, instead of reading the ID from the URL parameter, again, I'm going to call the context. And this time I want to pass in the session ID. And the session ID can be found in the registered claims.id. So I'm just going to pass that down as its argument. And then lastly, we have the revoke session call. Instead of reading the ID from the URL parameter, I'm going to get the claims from the request context. And then again, I can pass the claims.registeredclaims.id. And that is all we needed to do. Let's go ahead and make sure that our middlewares are working as expected. First, we have to make sure our MySQL container is running. And we can do that by calling docker run on our MySQL image. We have the name field, the port forwarding, as well as the environment variable. And we can confirm our container is running with docker ps. And we can exec into this container to create our database called ecom. And once the database has been created, we can apply the migration file by calling the migrate image and the up command. We have done this many times, but here we have the migrate image with the path to our migration files, our database connection string, and the up command. And that's going to apply all the migration up files we have. And lastly, we can cd into our cmd ecom API and run our main.go file. And I'm going to test these endpoints using Postman. First, I want to create our users. So I can do that by making a post request to the user's endpoint. And I'm going to pass the JSON request body. And first, I'm going to create an admin, send this post request. And I'm also going to create a user that's not an admin. So this Boolean field is going to be false. And now that these users have been created, let's try to log in with each of the users. So I just need email and password to our login endpoint, and that's going to give us the access token as well as the refresh token. I'm going to open another tab and do the same thing for the admin. So make a post request. The email is going to be admin@gmail.com. Password, it's just going to be password. I actually have a typo here, send it again, and we have another set of access token as well as a refresh token for this admin user. Now we want to create an order, but before we create an order, we actually have to create some products. So I'm going to make a post request to the products endpoint, and inside our body, I'm just going to paste what I have already prepared. And if I send this request to the products endpoint without any token in the authorization header, this request is going to fail. As you can see, we get an error saying that the authorization header is missing. So let's try to add the user's access token in the authorization header. In Postman, you can do that by clicking on this authorization tab and click this bearer token auth type. And inside the token field here, I'm going to paste this token that I just copied. And this token is just a header that you can see here as well. So we have the authorization header and the value. If you actually click here to view what's here, you can see that we have the bearer keyword as well as the token. And if we try to make this request, you can see that we get an error saying that the user is not an admin. So we need to pass the access token of the admin. So I'm going to paste this token here, come back to this products endpoint request, and inside our authorization header, I'm going to paste this new token. And if I make this request, you can see that this product has been made. And I'm just going to create one more product. And if I try to list the products, you can see that the two products have been created. And now that we have created our products, let's try to create an order under a user. So I'm going to open another tab and make a post request to the orders endpoint. So inside the JSON request body, I'm going to paste what I have already prepared. We have this list of items as well as the payment method, text price, and so on. And this time I'm going to pass the access token of the user. So I'm going to copy this token here, and back inside our orders endpoint, I'm going to pass this access token inside the authorization header. So now if I try to make this request, the order has been created, and we can confirm this in our database as well. So I have this database pulled up here, and if we go into the orders table, you can see this order has been created, and you can see that the user ID associated with this order is 2, and that's referring to our user here. And let's just test one more endpoint to see if I can get my order. So I'm going to make a get request to my order endpoint, and inside the header or the authorization header, I'm going to pass my bearer token and make this request, and you can see that we get this order as the response. And if I make this request without a token, again, we get this error saying that the authorization header is missing. I'm going to leave it to you to test the rest of the endpoints, but that's all I wanted to cover in this video. Thank you all for watching.